How can you know there's an external world? A world that exists outside your own mind, full of rocks and trees and people. After all, isn't it possible all these perceptions are mistaken because you're being deceived right now by a powerful evil demon? You may laugh and think, that's completely ridiculous. But what evidence would you put forward to show that that's not true? That there really are people and rocks and trees out there. They're not just mere perceptions. This skeptical scenario was thought up by Rene Descartes, and epistemologists have been trying to respond to it ever since. In this video, I'm joined by professional epistemologist, Dr. Kevin McCain, to discuss how this skeptical scenario poses such a problem for knowledge of the external world, and how to respond to it. So, do you know anything about the external world after all? Yes, you do, but you'll have to watch to the end of the video to see why. And we're starting right now. Dr. McCain, what is philosophical skepticism?
Various forms of philosophical skepticism will challenge whether we actually have knowledge within certain domains. So the most commonly talked about, and the one that we plan to talk about today, is external world skepticism. So this was made really popular by Descartes, and then since then, a lot of epistemology has been really focused on this problem. And that sort of skepticism challenges whether we know things about the world around us, including about our own bodies, because those are external to our mind. Other sorts of philosophical skepticism challenge other domains. So, for instance, memory skepticism challenges whether we know things that we apparently remember. Another sort could be skepticism about induction. So we think that every other time I've held a rock in the air and let go of it, it's fallen. We think, well, then I know that the next time I do that, it's going to fall too. Well, inductive skepticism challenges that, right? Whether we can actually know that the next time you let go of a rock, it's going to fall. So philosophical skepticism just challenges whether we have, like I said, an epistemic good. Typically, it's put in terms of knowledge, whether we know the things that we think we know in whatever particular domain.
Now, why should we bother thinking about skeptical scenarios and skeptical arguments if almost no one actually accepts philosophical skepticism?
I think in the book, I mentioned two reasons. One, because there are some serious philosophers who are skeptics about various epistemic goods. And they're very smart and they thought about it for a long time. And so that gives us some reason to think, okay, maybe we should take this somewhat seriously. But as you mentioned, Jordan, they're a very small portion. Almost no epistemologists are actually skeptics of that sort. There are a few, but not very many. But a lot of epistemologists think that working on skepticism or thinking about skeptical problems is very fruitful because it allows us to better understand the epistemic concepts and the things that we're thinking about. So thinking about external world skepticism about knowledge, say, can help us better understand knowledge. And really, if we look back, like even to Descartes, this is what Descartes was up to. So sometimes when I teach this, my students get confused and they think Descartes was a skeptic, but he absolutely wasn't. His whole purpose in presenting the skeptical scenario was to motivate and work through his own epistemology, right? His own take on what does it take to know things. And so by digging into the skeptical puzzles and problems, we can grapple with something that in a lot of ways is a genuine feature of our human experience, but also really helps us get clearer on important aspects of epistemology. All of the other things I just said also applies to Christian philosophers, right? They should care for those reasons as well. But there's another reason, and even Christians that aren't, say, philosophers should care about this some, because getting clearer about skepticism, I think, really clues us in about what we think in our ordinary life and in science and all these things, what sort of level of support we can really have and how secure our knowledge actually is. And what sometimes happens when you talk, say, with a secular person is they'll assume that the standard for belief or knowledge is really high. And so they'll say, so see, Christian belief, you don't have that for your Christian belief, so they're not reasonable. You don't have knowledge of these things. But they don't realize that if they apply that same standard, then we don't have any knowledge or beliefs about anything about the world around us. And so by looking at the skeptical puzzles and getting clear on, okay, what does it actually take to know something? What sorts of reasons are good enough reasons to believe things? Then it becomes clearer to say, well, wait a minute, the beliefs that we have as Christians are on a par with these beliefs. And so if the religious skeptic wants to say, oh, these aren't reasonable, or you can't know this stuff, or you're irrational for thinking it, then they're actually committed to something way more extreme, right? If they apply the standard fairly to all the other beliefs, then it's going to undermine a lot of things. And so I think that's why it's really important, because the clearer we get on how good the evidence has to be or how good our reasons have to be in order to have knowledge, then we can start to see, well, wait a minute. If we apply that same standard as we should, then if we can meet the standard with beliefs about the external world and science and so on, then we can meet them with our beliefs about Christianity as well.
What is Descartes' demon, and what is the argument from such a demon to skepticism about the external world?
The classic thought experiment is Descartes says, as part of his epistemological project, he wants to call into doubt as many of his beliefs as he can, right? And so just a wild scenario he comes up with is he says, what if I'm being deceived by a really powerful evil demon? He actually starts with thinking, well, if God wanted to deceive me, God could deceive me. But Descartes was a Christian, and so Descartes knows, he says, well, wait a minute, God wouldn't do that. So it couldn't be God. God's not a deceiver because that requires imperfection. God's perfect. And so, but then he goes, but wait a minute, what about a demon that was really powerful? And he says, could such a demon trick me? Could the demon make it seem to me that I'm talking to you right now on this computer? He doesn't say that because he's not talking about computers, but putting myself in Descartes' place, could a demon trick me into thinking that I'm talking to you now? Could a demon trick me into thinking that I've got hands that I've been waving about? And the thought is, yes, that's at least possible in a very broad sense of possible. And so then we start to get an argument from that because now I've got this possibility that seems consistent with all of my evidence, right? So all of the reasons I have from how things look and how they smell and taste and touch and everything, the demon hypothesis that the demon is making me have all these sensations fits with that. It's at least logically consistent with it. And so then we face this challenge of how can I prefer one rather than the other? What makes me justified or reasonable or rational, or how can I know that I'm talking to you now rather than I'm just a disembodied soul being tricked by this powerful demon? There's various different ways to formulate the argument, and some are better than others. But one of the simplest is what's sometimes called the closure argument that just says roughly the following. If I know, say that I have hands, just any proposition about the external world, if I know that I have hands, then I know that I'm not the victim of some sort of skeptical scenario. So I know that I'm not deceived by Descartes' demon, or a more contemporary thing, I know I'm not in the matrix, or I know that that I'm not having some sort of really vivid dream or whatever. So if I know I have hands, then I know I'm not in a skeptical scenario. Then the next premise is, well, I don't know that I'm not in a skeptical scenario. Well, then it follows logically from that I don't know that I have hands. And then since having hands was just a randomly picked external world proposition about the world around us, you can plug in anything about the world around you. So if I know that I'm talking to you right now on a computer screen, then I know I'm not deceived by Descartes' demon. I don't know I'm not deceived, so I don't know that I'm talking to you, right? If I know there's a tree outside and so on. So anything. And so this sort of argument threatens all of our beliefs about the world around us.
So just to make that crystal clear, I'm going to state the argument exactly the way that you did in your book, Epistemology, 50 Puzzles, Paradoxes, and Thought Experiments. This is on page 57. 1. You don't know that you're not deceived by Descartes' demon. 2. If you don't know that you're not deceived by Descartes' demon, then you don't know anything about the world around you. 3. Therefore, you don't know anything about the world around you. Now, in this same book, you give 7 responses to this argument, and we're going to go one by one. The first response is based on reliabilism. So what is that?
Reliabilism is a view in epistemology that says it's a kind of what's called externalist view. It says whether you're justified in believing something just depends on whether or not, assuming that the belief is true, that the belief is produced by a cognitive faculty that is reliable, so that tends to produce more true beliefs than false beliefs. Now, there's a whole lot of problems with reliabilism. I think reliabilism is false, but we don't have time to go into all these reasons. If anyone's interested, my friend Matt Fries has a lot of good work on challenging reliabilism. But at any rate, one reason you might want to be a reliabilist is it can seemingly get you out of this argument, right? Because the reliabilist can say, well, look, if my belief that I have hands is produced by reliable cognitive faculties, and it's true, then I know it, even if I don't know that I'm not deceived by a demon, right? And they can also even say, well, I don't believe I'm deceived by a demon. If that belief is reliably produced and true, then I know that I'm not deceived by a demon. One of the things that a lot of internalists, so people who think that you need to have reasons that you yourself have, don't like this sort of response is it seems like a bit of a cheat. Like it's all about, well, if they're reliable and true, then I can know this stuff. But one worry is I seem to be left with a pretty big if, right? A skeptic is often going to say, well, what reason do you have to think your faculties are reliable? Well, I believe these various things. I believe they're reliable. And if that's reliable, then, right. And so you can see the sort of worry there. But that is one response that people take. And one reason that people have been at least attracted to externalist views like that is to get out of the skeptical problem. And so one worry is that they think that this is what we need to do to avoid this scary problem, as you mentioned. And so they go that route. I think there are other ways, though, that are better.
Okay, the second response is based on a sensitivity account of knowledge. So what is that?
The sensitivity account is another externalist view, but a sensitivity condition on knowledge basically says, in order to know something, if your belief were false, right? So if my having hands were false, then I wouldn't believe it. And so the way sensitivity accounts get out of this is they actually deny closure. So on a sensitivity view, it can be true that I know that I have hands and true that I don't know that I'm not deceived by Descartes' demon. They deny that what was in our conditional premise, the claim that says, well, look, if you don't know that you're not deceived by a demon, then you don't know that you have hands. They deny closure. So on a sensitivity account, it can be true that you know that P, it can be true that actually P entails not Q, but you don't know not Q, even if you're aware of the demon, right? That's another route you can go I think it's even less popular than reliabilism and less plausible. But some have went that way. And so I mention all these because, like with reliabilism, there's a lot of very capable defenders and a lot of very smart epistemologists, I think, like the view. Sensitivity is less popular, significantly less popular, but it has had major defenders like Fred Dredske and Robert Nozick, and it has contemporary defenders as well.
The third response is based on contextualism. What is that?
Contextualism is an epistemological response, but it's linguistic based, right? So it says our word know, like when we say Jordan knows something, that the word know is context sensitive. The thought is certain words in our language are sensitive to the context of utterance. So when you and I are talking about, say, 6-year-olds, we might truly say of one of the 6-year-olds, oh, he is super tall. But if we were in the context of talking about NBA players, then it would be false to say of the 6-year-old, oh, he's super tall. No, because we're in a different context. So contextualists insist that the word knows, so knowledge and all the different ways we say it and express the word knows, is context sensitive. And so their way out of the argument is to say, when we're in our ordinary everyday context, we're not thinking about skepticism, we're not worried about any of this stuff. It's true to say of us that Jordan knows that he has hands, Kevin knows there's a tree outside, whatever. But in the conversational context that you and I are in right now, because we're thinking about Descartes' demon, we're thinking about the skeptical problem, it's no longer true to say that you know that you have hands and I know there's a tree out there. Because they'll say, when the context shifts, the standards for knowledge are harder to achieve. So in a non-skeptical context or ordinary context, the standards for knowing are pretty easy to meet. When we're worried about skeptical problems, when we're thinking about it, one thing that you may not like about this, well, there's various things. One is you might think it's a bit puzzling that a lot of ordinary competent speakers of English, when you tell them that the word know is context sensitive, they don't see it that way. Whereas any other context sensitive word in their language, like when I told you about tall, or if I tell you about flat, you immediately see it go, yeah, that's context sensitive. That's one worry. Another worry is on contextualism, the skeptic's right.
The fourth response is the Moorean approach. What is that?
The Moorean approach is interesting, and there's various ways of spelling it out, but the simplest is Moore basically says, I'm more sure, and rationally so, more certain that I know that I have hands, say, than I am that the argument for skepticism you and I just discussed is sound. And so Moore says, you give me any philosophical argument against something like that I know I have hands, and I should be more sure that I know I have hands than that there isn't something wrong with your argument. And so it's this plausibility comparison of, well, which is more likely? That I don't know that I have hands, or that there's some subtle error in this philosophy argument that I can't figure out? And so Moore said the Moorean move is to say, look, you do know you have hands, and you know that if you know that, then you know you're not deceived by the demon, so you're not deceived by the demon, right? You just shift it around and say, I should go with the premises that I'm most certain of. One worry about this route that people have is it doesn't actually say anything about where the skeptic's argument goes wrong, right? There's no, in a sense, where the skeptic can stand firm and we stand firm and we just butt heads. So one worry is, and that's commonly put to it, is it seems problematically dogmatic. Like, I'm not actually figuring out an error. I'm just sticking to this is what I think, and so I can rule the other out. I think it's probably more sophisticated than that, but that is a worry for it. In my bigger picture, I think there may be a role for the Moorean response, but I think it can't be the whole story.
The fifth response appeals to what are called hinge propositions. What are those?
This idea people draw from Wittgenstein, where he claimed that in rational inquiry, there are certain propositions that have to hold fixed because rational inquiry is like a door that has to swing on a hinge. And without a fixed point, the door can't swing. And so a lot of people have done this. One of the most prominent is Crispin Wright. And so he has a lot of really interesting work where he says, like, with response to external world skepticism, Crispin's view is, I can't have evidence against Descartes' demon. So I can't have evidence because I have to assume this before I can begin the process of, evaluating evidence. But he argues in various ways that we're rationally entitled to accept that there's an external world or trust that there is. There's various problems with this and worries we might have is if this entitlement and this trust isn't based on reasons or evidence of the normal sort, then there's a worry that, well, is this just a practical thing or how do we get the sort of knowledge that we think we have via evidence from something that isn't itself supported by evidence or isn't? And so that's a worry there. But he's got a lot of interesting discussion on this. I've actually been looking at some of his stuff more recently after talking with him about it. And there's a lot there, but I still worry about it.
The sixth response comes from David Chalmers, and his view may seem puzzling on the face of it, but he says that Descartes' demon isn't a skeptical scenario after all. Can you explain that to us?
Chalmers usually talks about the matrix. That's his preferred thing to talk about in these virtual realities, but you can apply it to Descartes' demon. So Chalmers' sort of view says it's the structure is all that matters. And so on his sort of view, if I were to learn that rather than what, say, fundamental physics tells us about the nature of my hands, right, what they're made of, these particles, if I were to learn instead, no, they're made by ones and zeros in a computer program, or maybe through some sort of mechanism via the demon, he, at least in one incarnation of his view, says, that's not skeptical. I still know that I have hands. I've just learned hands at this fundamental level is very different than I thought. He says learning that we were in a certain sort of skeptical scenario is like learning fundamental physics, right? So if we were so one way to make his view seem fairly plausible is you say, okay, right now we believe, setting aside the sort of composition folks that don't believe they're a composite object, most people believe there are tables and chairs or trees or what have you. So I'm looking at a tree and I believe there's a tree. Fundamental physics tells me it's mainly empty space, right? It's these small subatomic particles doing weird stuff, right? These quarks and everything. Well, what if we were to learn that, say, string theory was true, that it's ultimately strings at the bottom? Chalmers says, yeah, you still know it's a tree. You just now know more about the metaphysics of trees. Or if you learn it's something else, right? What is it? Like the loops or something, right? You still know it's a tree, right? Nothing has changed there. And so Chalmers wants to say the same thing is true of skeptical scenarios. Now, of course, there's a few worries about this. One is, well, if that's right, it's difficult to see why for hundreds of years people worried about skepticism. Those who did. That's a big thing to me. David Chalmers is a very brilliant philosopher, but it's like, why did we have to wait for Chalmers to figure this out so that we didn't need to worry about this at all? And then some of the other is, it's not clear that it's going to get us out of all the sort of skeptical worries. And we might think that, well, it really makes a difference what stuff is made of. If we find out that other people around me are really just inputs from the demon, that matters, right? I might be right about, I have hands, but I'm going to be wrong about I'm talking to Jordan, right? Because there's no Jordan. And that seems really important, right? So it seems like it leaves some pretty heavy-duty skeptical worries in place. In fairness to Chalmers, he's often explicit about that. Like, say, yeah, this leaves skepticism about the past and these various other kinds, like it's just for external world skepticism.
Okay, so all of those responses are worthy of mention. Some are better than others, but none of those are the response that you favor. Your preferred response to this skeptical scenario is an inference to the best explanation. And you've actually defended this in your book, Evidentialism and epistemic justification.
Inference is the best explanation is just a way that we reason. And we often reason this way a lot. But a great example of this is, so if you're a fan of Sherlock Holmes, right, when he gets all the data, he looks like, okay, there's a certain sort of footprint, a certain sort of cigar ash. He says he deduces it, but really it's an inference the best explanation. That this person did it is the best explanation of the evidence. And so that's what we see in detective cases, right? It's a method that we see in science, right? So why do we accept particular scientific theory over another one? Well, this one theory better explains the data, right? So inference the best explanation is roughly just the idea that when you have some facts that need to be explained and you have a good explanation of them that's better than all the other explanations, you should infer that best explanation is true. And arguably, there's empirical research that kind of backs a lot of this up. Arguably, we start engaging in this kind of reasoning super early in development. Some even contend as early as young infants and very young children. In various places, I argue that it's actually the foundation of all of our justification and all of our support that way. Now, you don't have to go that far to accept this response, skepticism, right? The response to skepticism only requires that you accept that inference to the best explanation is a good way to reason, right? So that's as far as you have to go. So if you like the methods of science and say, if you think detectives and others can solve crimes in this way, then you're already buying into inference to the best explanation. And in our everyday life, we do this as well. You come home. So if you have a pet, you come home, you see the pet food's turned over. You see there's a mess in the floor and like a chewed up pillow next to your pet dog. There's various explanations for what happened. One is the neighbor's cat somehow is super intelligent, came over, framed the dog and left undetectably. Another one is your dog dumps the stuff over and got the pillow, right? Clearly the second is a better explanation. And we reason like that. Often we do it, we're so used to it that we don't even realize we're doing it. It's just almost automatic. But that's the gist of that. Now, how does that apply to skepticism? Well, notice the whole skeptical problem gets underway because the skeptic or ourselves considering it raises an alternative hypothesis for all of our experiences, right? The evidence we have from experiences, maybe from memory and so on, they say, hey, here's another potential explanation. It could be that instead of you interacting with the world around you, you have been interacting with Descartes' demon. That would account for all of your evidence. Why is it that you can't know that you're not deceived by a demon? Well, the skeptic says you can't know because that fits all the evidence. It could explain the evidence. And so could the external world view that we have, our common sense view, or what I sometimes call the real world hypothesis. They both account for the data. And so since they do, you have no reason to prefer one over the other. So you can't know which is true. Now, the inference of the best explanation response comes back and says, they're both consistent with the data to a large degree, but our ordinary view of the world, that it's full of ordinary objects, that I'm talking to you and so on, better explains it. It's an excellent explanation and it best explains that data. So I can know that I'm not deceived by Descartes' demon, which allows me to get out of the argument.
I'm going to put your argument on the screen here, and I want to give credit to my friend, Dr. Andrew Moon, for putting your argument in this form. It makes it really clear this way. So let EW represent this proposition. There is an external world of enduring and relatively stable physical objects. My experiences are typically caused by these objects stimulating my sense organs. That's what EW is going to represent. Now, here's the inference to the best explanation, laid out in a total of 4 steps. Step 1, I have memory and perceptual experiences that are regular and orderly. 2, EW is a good explanation of 1. 3, no other explanation, including Descartes' demon, is nearly as good as EW. 4, so probably EW is true. Okay, so that's your argument, and if my viewers just pause for a moment and reflect on it, 1 and 2 are pretty clear. So we're not going to take much time to really defend those 2 premises. The argument really comes down to premise 3. So with the remainder of this video, I want to focus on you responding to objections to that premise. In answering those objections, it should become clear to the viewers how EW is superior to skeptical scenarios like Descartes' demon. Okay, so the first objection goes like this. Premise 3 is false because Descartes' demon is as good an explanation as EW, and perhaps even better. Why? Because Descartes' demon is a single entity that can explain all my diverse perceptual experience. That makes the demon hypothesis very simple. Since both hypotheses have roughly the same explanatory power and explanatory scope, and the demon hypothesis is very simple, the two explanations seem to be on a par. What are your thoughts on that objection?
Yeah, that's a great one. I think one thing, the skeptic has to be careful in making the argument, because the skeptical position, to be truly skeptical, can't be that we should think we're deceived by the demon, right? So they have to get it to where we want to par, right? Because if they're granting inference to the best explanation and they go, wow, look, and the demon hypothesis is the best explanation, then they're no longer skeptical. We should actually think this. And not actually, we won't get into that now. Jonathan Bogle has some great stuff on this where like that creates a problem for the skeptic, because they end up by trying to say that all these various skeptical alternatives are all on a par with the real world hypothesis or the EW. They end up committed to claiming, actually, you should believe these are true or something. Anyway, we'll set that aside. With the simplicity, I think there's a few things, and it's a really good one to think about. Like there are different sorts of simplicity, for one thing, right? So there's simplicity in terms of the number of objects, which is what this does. Then there's simplicity in terms of kinds, right? Do we have to posit a new kind? Well, we have to posit a sort of demon that has this ability that might be a new kind. It's different than what we see in our experiences. But there's other problems too. Even if we grant that it's simpler in certain ways, there are other ways it's not as simple, and there are other explanatory virtues. So one of the things I often point out is with a basic sort of demon hypothesis, we lose out on predictive power. So if we just say a demon is causing me to have these sensations, I lose out on being able to predict that, oh, when I look back in a few seconds, it's still going to look like the tree, and it's going to look similar to what it looked like before. On EW, I can predict that, and that prediction is accurate. On the demon, I can't predict it, but then I just can say, well, when it turns out, it's the same. So you have this predictive advantage, which is very important. So if you look at science, one of the big things is, hey, you've got two theories. This one predicts new data. This one doesn't, but it's made to fit all of it. It's consistent with it, but it didn't predict it. The one that predicts it, that's a big bomb. Now, you might try to get around this. So Mike Bergman does, when he's got some criticisms of my sort of view, where he says, well, what if the demon is just, their goal is to make everything look as if EW is true. And so now you have the predictive power, right? There's worries there about if that can really work out. But ultimately, I think just to lay out a few things with this, with the simplicity, Jonathan Bogle has some great work on how necessary truths can play an explanatory role given EW that they can't play given the demon hypothesis, right? So one that I like to use, it's a little tricky, but there's just a theorem of geometry, the triangle inequality theorem. Basically that the two sides, if you have an actual triangle, the two sides of triangle will add up to a longer length than the remaining side. And this holds in Euclidean geometry, but then, the immediate worry is, well, wait a minute, maybe our universe isn't Euclidean so it holds in any universe, any sort of space that has a well-defined distance function, right? So it holds in non-Euclidean spaces as well. So we can, but the gist of it is this, that's a necessary truth. So both hypotheses have to be committed to it. In EW, this can do explanatory work for me. Why is it that when I am standing at, say, home plate, and I'm looking at first base and I'm looking at third, why is it that it will take me longer to go from, or assuming I have sensations of this time and of moving at the same rate of speed, why is it that my experiences will have a longer duration if I experience going from home to first base, then to third, rather than going directly from home to third? Well, triangle inequality theorem in the EW says because it's a longer distance, right? And it does this work. There is no distance involved in the demon hypothesis. So why does my experiences have this feature? Why do they have this regularity that anytime I seem to be taking the long way around, it takes longer than going the short way? Well, presumably it's because the demon has some intention to make it seem this way. But that's an additional thing that the demon hypothesis has to posit to do the explanatory work that a necessary truth is doing in EW. And so you have these all over the place. And so you have the demon hypothesis is simpler when it comes to maybe number of entities. It's maybe more complex when it comes to kinds of entities. And it seems more complex when it comes to the sort of simplicity that I think actually matters. I don't think the counting entities, there's problems with how to do that. I think it's number of fundamental regularities you have to assume. That's the one that counts. And the EW does better there. And then another just general thing that I'm actually working on a new book on this sort of stuff, right? The explanatory solutions to skeptical problems. So I try to lay these out. But one of the things I do there is to point out that in the context of this debate, when the skeptic attacks premise 3 here, there's often this assumption that the skeptical hypothesis and EW are starting out as equals, and then we're looking at how well they evaluate the data. Well, one of the things I argue now, and the things I'm working on, is that's actually not true, that the skeptical scenarios take on a lot of philosophical baggage that EW doesn't. So they are committed to various claims about the world. So for instance, in order to get a skeptical scenario, one thing they seem to be committed to is that if the skeptical scenario is true, all these beliefs are false. But that requires commitment to certain views, to denying certain views of the nature of truth, right? So like a coherence view of truth, which I don't accept and I think is an implausible view, but I'm not certain that it's wrong, right? Because people like Donald Davidson and other important philosophers held these views, says that as long as it's all coherent, then that's what makes it true. Well, the skeptic's got to deny that in order for this to be a problem. EW doesn't, right? And so you've got that sort of things with things about truth. You have the sort of Putnam worries. So Putnam had this sort of response to skepticism that said, given content externalism, given the idea that my beliefs get their content fixed based on the world I'm in, if I were always deceived by a demon, then I wouldn't be wrong about any of these beliefs because they wouldn't mean what we typically take them to mean. Well, the skeptic has to either, it seems like, make some sort of denial of that sort of move, or say, well, I've only recently become, which is the common response, say, well, I've recently become the victim of a demon. Well, now, if that's built into the hypothesis, now you've got that, well, the world was, as EW said, for a long time, and then somehow it changed drastically, right? Which seems more complex, and there's more to the story. So anyway, that's just the layout. I think these sorts of considerations make EW simpler and already it starts off in a better place because it's not committed to all these.
Okay, the second objection goes like this. Premise 3 is unjustified because we may not have conceived of all the skeptical alternatives that are possible. How can we say that no other explanation is as good as EW if there are all these unconceived alternatives?
Yeah, I think that's a great one because this is a real worry in debates in philosophy of science, right? This is one of the main arguments for anti-realism about science of saying, well, how can you accept that your current best theory is true given that there's all these unconceived ones that are plausibly as good? The big thing I think with this sort of debate that's different is I think we have good reason to think there aren't any that are as good. Come up with the skeptical scenario, EW is better. We have no reason to think that there is any sort of scenario that's going to match EW. And the reason why is because all the sorts of considerations that apply to Descartes' Demon seem to apply to any skeptical scenario. It seems like the only way we get closer and closer to EW is we morph the hypothesis closer and closer to EW to where it loses that skeptical bite where you're like, oh, well, it's like this, but maybe everything is, your vision's all, but everything's slightly to the left or something. So what? So I think the difference here is, unlike with the scientific case, where we actually do have reason to think there are unconceived alternatives, right? Because if you look at the history of science, at least to some degree, that's happened, right? Like this was the best and we all thought it was true, but we hadn't conceived of these alternatives. And then we think of them and like, oh, wow, they're really good. No one has ever come up with an alternative to EW that's as good as EW. So I think that there's good reason to think there's not. All the skeptical scenarios, even though various ones have different weaknesses, they all share a large number of problems that make EW better than like the class of those. And so that gives us good reason to think there's just something about that class of hypothesis that's inferior to EW.
The third objection is that premise 3 is unjustified because it's not enough for EW to be a better explanation than Descartes' Demon. EW needs to be better than the disjunct of all the alternative hypotheses.
This is actually something Ted Poston and I called the disjunction objection to just inference of the best explanation in general. It's why should you think that the best explanation is likely to be true because the disjunct of its rivals, even if it's the best, they could be more probable. The response that Ted and I give to that general objection is to say, well, the best explanation, so even though we talk of inference of the best explanation, it's got to be the best sufficiently good. right? And so that doesn't get out of the problem yet, but it says before you can infer, it's got to not only be better than the rivals, it's got to also be good enough. And we put the good enough, we add a probability constraint to avoid this sort of problem in general of it's got to be sufficiently probable. There's other ways to cash this out. So Finner-Delson has some interesting work on how to cash out when it's good enough, right? His is roughly this idea that when we've investigated sufficiently and the best explanation for why we haven't come up with a rival that's as good is that there isn't one, then that makes it good enough. So I think EW satisfies both of those. But to your sort of concern, doesn't it have to be better than the demon and all these others when we look at those probabilities? Yeah, I think you're right. But I think this is why we don't assign them like a probability of even 1%. Because think of this. Think of the demon. Here's a hypothesis. You're being deceived by Descartes' demon. Here's another one. You're being deceived by Descartes' demon twins. There's two of them. Here's another one. Maybe you're being deceived by the demon triplets, right? There's an infinite number of these. If we assign them any probability above 0 or an infinitesimally small number, then the probability of that disjunction is going to be above 100%, right? It's going to be above 1. So that can't be right. And so one of the typical things in probability is, well, if we have this infinite disjunction of these, they're all going to be assigned probability 0. And so I think what we end up saying, we have to assign a low probability to all these, extremely low, either 0 or infinitesimal. But the other thing is this, when we think of these various hypotheses, we think, well, there could be the demon, maybe the demon's got colors, it's a red demon, a blue demon, multiple demons. We're thinking, well, look, there's all of these possibilities. Well, we can make a similar move with EW, right? So there's the real world hypothesis, but there's the one in which we don't have it all figured out, but say where string theory is true, right? Where fundamentally the physical objects are made of strings. There's one where fundamentally there's something else and so on. These are all versions of EW that seem fine and so on. So we could multiply all this disjunction of EW, and each of these are better than those. And so I think the way we get out of this in kind of the most kind of commonsensical way is to say, what we're actually doing is comparing an entire class of explanations. So we're looking at the class of skeptical explanations and the class of non-skeptical explanations, right? What we would call like the EW versions of EW. And we're comparing which class of explanations is superior. And so that allows us to infer that the truth is one in the EW group rather than the skeptical group, right? And so we knock out the disjunctions altogether because we're looking at two big disjunctions maybe. So I think that's the more straightforward, commonsensical way. We can avoid a lot of the talk of the probability stuff and just say, look, we're looking at classes. Do the non-skeptical class, how does that match up with the skeptical one? Non-skeptical one is way better explanations. And then now our work is to do the work of science and figure out which one of those is true.
Okay, this last objection, it's not so much an objection to premise 3, it's just an objection to this inference to the best explanation response in general. And here's how it might go. Someone might say, so what? Even if this inference to the best explanation works, how useful is it? Normal people don't use this. They probably aren't even aware of this type of response. Yet, supposedly, normal people have knowledge of the external world.
Yeah, that's great. And in one sense, I think that's right, because I think we don't have to go through an inference to get there, like that sort of inference. But on the other hand, I think the reason they know all these external propositions about the external world is because those really are the best explanation of their evidence. So on my view, what makes it so that the evidence they have, the experiences they have, actually supports believing the external world propositions is there is this explanatory connection. But what allows them to know isn't that they're aware of that connection, it's that they have the evidence and they respond to it appropriately, right? So it's, they don't have to go through this argument. So like the person down the hall from me or whatever doesn't have to go, well, I need to know about why I'm not deceived by Descartes' demon in order to know that I'm going to drink a cup of coffee or something. Like, no, they can just see it and they know that. But the reason why their visual experiences, their tactile experiences and so on support believing that is that it is the best explanation of that data. Now, what gets interesting is once you start thinking about the skeptical problems, now, how do I, as an ordinary person, if I haven't thought of this argument, right? So I'm in, say, intro to philosophy and I get told about Descartes' demon and I'm worried about like, oh, how do I know this? Well, in one sense, I think we do latch on to the explanatory differences. So there's an older book, Keith DeRose, another epistemologist, described that his students often have this kind of, oh, come on, response to skeptical hypotheses. And I think there's something to that. I think they're actually tracking like, that's not a good explanation. They may not be able to pinpoint exactly why the external world one is better, so on, but I think we can latch onto these things. And this is where earlier I mentioned that the Moorean response might have a role to play. I think that the Moorean response might be plausible for the ordinary person because they're tracking these explanatory relations. So it's perfectly fine to them to go like, look, I know this fits better. I know I have hands, so I can't be in that. Why do they know they have hands? Because they can see that's such a better explanation. They may not be able to pinpoint all the fine details, but they're tracking those explanatory relations. And I think that can justify them even when presented with the skeptical argument, because they can maybe reasonably make a Moorean response because underlying the viability of that response is this deeper explanatory response.
That concludes this portion of the interview, but my patrons get access to a bonus clip. In that clip, Dr. McCain shares his thoughts on whether skepticism is actually self-defeating. To become a patron and watch the clip, check out the link below. I want to thank Routledge for sending me a copy of this book, and if you want to pick up a copy for yourself, just check out the link in the description below. Let me know what you think about this inference to the best explanation response to skepticism about the external world. Do you think it works? Do you think you have knowledge of the external world? If so, how? Leave your thoughts in a comment. This video was really heavy on epistemology, and this book is a great place to start if you're brand new to the topic. But if you want to take your epistemology game to the next level, then click this video right here. You'll find the top 5 books that you should read on epistemology.